Well, I'll kick us off now. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction. I'll introduce Maria and then we'll get started. Before I do anything, I'm going to send the meeting agenda in the chat. So if you don't already have that up, please do so. You'll find space to take notes and also add your own questions for Maria. So if you've never been to one of these sessions before, my name is Samantha Lee. I'm on the Learning and Development team here at GitLab, and we host live speaker series with people like Maria from all different organizations and companies to speak about topics that are relevant to our GitLab values. And I'm really excited to have Maria Moss back to GitLab today to talk about feedback. And the title of today's session is Listen and Be Heard, Feedback in an All-Remote Workplace. So if you've never been to one of these sessions before, we follow the same format every time. For the first 20-25 minutes or so, it'll be a fireside chat between myself and Maria, and you can see which questions I'm going to ask her in the agenda. And then following that conversation, we'll open up the discussion to AMA with Maria. So if you have questions that maybe stem off of the questions that I asked Maria or other questions about feedback, you can feel free to add them to the team member questions section at the bottom of the agenda, and we'll get to as many as we can before the meeting ends. This session is going to be recorded, so I will share it with anyone if you have to drop off early or if someone wasn't able to attend live, and that way you can share it with your team members if you enjoy it. I think that's all I've got, so I'm gonna pass it over to you, Maria, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Well, that's always a tough question. So let me get off mute.
Oh, you're muted now.
Okay, it was saying mute on my screen. I was like, let me make sure I'm not on mute. Okay, so hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. I'm Maria Moss. Introducing myself is always weird. It's like talking about yourself. So my background, leadership and employee development, I've been in this space. I did the math like a week ago, 17 years, and it's crazy because I'm only 18. But my background is leadership and employee development, having the opportunity to work with, develop, grow leaders in all different spaces. I have experience with manufacturing, tech, engineering, and for about the last 7 years, I've been working as a consultant doing training, coaching, and leadership development pretty much around the world. So I have experience Europe, Middle East, and Asia, and all kinds of different places, just getting a chance, honestly, to me, to just help people, find what works for them. And I always define leadership as not a title, but definitely that influence, capacity, and process that each one of us possesses. And how do we leverage that and kind of lead with that? So that's kind of my professional background. Educational, I have an MBA from University of South Carolina. I have master trainer certification through Association of Talent Development and also through some vendors like Crucial Learning and different spaces like that. And I am just a lifelong learner and lover of people. So I think that's kind of my summary. And I'm in Savannah, Georgia. So you will hear the Georgia accent heavy with this one here today.
Great. Well, I'm really excited to have you back to GitLab, Maria, and to have this conversation about feedback today.
I'm happy to be back. I think this is like what, second, third time? It's been a couple times.
Second or third, yeah.
I'm
And some of you might recognize Maria if you've taken Crucial Conversations. She's one of the master trainers that's in the self-paced course, so you might have seen her there before. Great. Okay, well, let's get started with this first question. And this first one's about receiving feedback. So my question for you, Maria, is when we provide our full attention while listening, how can we affect the way we perceive or act on feedback?
I like it. I think that question to me kind of gives two parts too. So one of it is like, as we're providing our full attention on feedback or listening to that feedback, it's really important to listen to what's being shared and find the benefit of what is actually being shared in that feedback, even if it's not delivered perfectly. Because I definitely realize, the listening part, we're able to kind of absorb what people are saying, sometimes read into what people are saying. Sometimes it's not delivered perfectly, but I definitely feel like one of the beauty of being able to just kind of be present is that we're able to just kind of manage our own receiving of what we're getting in the feedback. I'm just really thinking about, a dear friend, Joseph Graney, who talks about, take back your pen is a saying that he uses, or retaking your pen. And it's really about when you get that feedback, no matter how it's delivered, the capacity to find value in the information that's shared, find the ability to use what you can use, even in those imperfectly delivered messages. So I definitely think having the mindset of retaking that pen, owning what you can from the feedback, even if it's not perfectly delivered or delivered perfectly, helps us with our perceptions of it. And I think it also helps us with being able to act on the feedback, because if the message, again, you're receiving some kind of glimmer of whatever this person's experience with you may be, perception of a situation may be, et cetera, you may not like it. And I can definitely think of times where I've heard feedback and in the moment, I just was like walking away, kind of rolling my eyes about the feedback. And it still was taking the time to just kind of sit down and process and say, what in that feedback, is value, or what in that feedback might be something I can leverage or use to maybe even change someone's perception of me, even if I don't agree with the entire feedback. So again, perception, managing our own, but also realizing that in receiving feedback from other people, a lot of times we're able to manage, their perceptions or their interpretation of us, which is also helpful. And that's some of the stuff that you can actually act on. And, to give an example, I remember getting some feedback once that I did not like. And the conversation went something like, have you ever noticed how people don't disagree with you in meetings? And I was like, what? And it was like, have you ever noticed how people don't feel comfortable disagreeing with you in meetings? And honestly, I was like, no. And so, the feedback coming from this person was, when you say things a lot of times, it comes across, and she dropped her hand like a hammer. And she said, when you give messages like that, people don't feel comfortable disagreeing with you, and have you noticed that? And my response in the moment, because again, it was kind of hard to hear. And I said back to her, why is that my problem? And that was my literal answer to her. I said, I feel comfortable disagreeing with anybody. Why is that my problem? And she said, it's not your problem. It really isn't. And she said, but here's what I want you to think about. And I appreciate now in hindsight that she told me, don't answer me right now, but I want you to just think about this. What might you be cutting yourself off from if people aren't comfortable disagreeing with your ideas? And she said, do you always think you have the best ideas? And I was like, no. And she said, so what might you be cutting yourself off? And she said, don't answer now, but I want you to go think about it. And for me, again, walking away from that, I heard her, I was listening. I didn't like it. My perception of what she was sharing wasn't that I didn't agree with her. I didn't like what was being shared. And I honestly didn't feel like it was my responsibility in that moment. But even in the walking away and just kind of pondering that question, what might I be cutting myself off from, made me just kind of stop, and say, while I don't agree with everything that was shared, I don't always think I have the best idea. I don't always think I'm right. And if other people aren't comfortable, challenging my ideas or sharing it, it ends up maybe not being best solutions or answers. And that's where I found the capacity to act, because I, had to swallow that little discomfort and then, kind of think about what can I do to make it where I'm as willing to kind of encourage other people to disagree with me as I am to disagree with other people's ideas. And that was my acting piece, because from that, I even kind of created a little preamble that I use in meetings that was opening up and saying, listen, in this meeting, we're going to talk about stuff. It's going to be important. It's going to be, decisions for the team. I am going to share ideas, and I'm also going to challenge other people's ideas. And I need everybody to be willing and comfortable to do that with me. And it was like that little preamble was the act, after I had to go deal with my feelings about the feedback. But that little piece that I started saying just really helped with creating a better space in our group conversations, in our meetings, and in our discussion. So, that's how you can take some of that stuff that you hear, manage your perception around it, and then find ways to act in ways that just help improve things.
Yeah, I really like that, because I think that it takes a lot of compassion. I think it takes a lot to have compassion for someone in the moment when they're giving you feedback that you don't like. And it takes some like self-compassion too, to recognize that you don't like it, but then still be willing to like find something in it that you can learn from. But that's can be really hard, because like it sounds like, at least in the example you shared, that like it kind of like tough feedback hits home. It like hits your identity and like what you feel about yourself. Like you were saying, you identified it, you responded and said, why is this my problem? But then being able to like have compassion for the person sharing it, for yourself, and to find an action out of it, I think is so powerful.
Love it. And it wasn't instant. It did take me like a week. I was butthurt for about a week. I'm not gonna lie. But it definitely was that, I didn't think that person was sharing from a bad place, and they weren't a person, which I think kind of goes to just even trust. And maybe we'll talk about that. But, this was a person too that overall I trusted and we had a good relationship. And I think that made the feedback hurt a little bit more, but it also made me, at least, like you said, have the compassion and the willingness to say, but she would only tell me this if this was something that might help. So right now, while it's not feeling good, let me try to find the good. And I think the other thing that was kind of hard too, and we probably all experienced it with feedback, is I wasn't intentionally doing anything. It was just me showing up as me that was causing this, I call it opportunity in hindsight, but it was like, I'm just showing up as my authentic self. Why should I change that? Or why should I be different in how I do that? And that's what made it hurtful to me, because I was like, I challenge anybody's ideas, which I did. And it was like, it wasn't about changing me, which is what I had to kind of process too. It was like, my end result is I want us to make the best decisions, do the most awesome work, like show up and have like rock star stuff happening every day from our team. Like that was what I really wanted, at the end of the day. So if that's what I really want, how can I temper my approach? I'm not going to change who I am, but temper my approach based on this great feedback that I got that was hard to hear, in order to get us to that result. And that little preamble, the first time I said it, I don't know if it worked perfectly, maybe not the second time, but it was, honest to goodness, my willingness to say, I'm going to keep being me. I'm going to still push. I'm still going to challenge ideas. I'm still going to share. And I want you to do the same thing. And when I noticed it wasn't happening, then I'm looking around and saying, April, tell me more about this. Like, what did I say that was wrong? Or Cal, all the holes in what I just shared, poke them. Like, let me see what I don't hear. Like, even just that additional kind of reinforcing of, I want to hear what I'm giving y'all, definitely made it where over time, I didn't have to preamble, but it wasn't that first time, but it was definitely that compassion for myself. I like me, I want to be me, but I also have awareness now of something that I'm doing, even unintentionally, that may be impacting things that I care about. How do I tweak something to make it work in our favor?
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, because examples like that are really powerful, and like, you have to be vulnerable to share stuff like that. So I appreciate that.
You're welcome. I'll tell you.
So you mentioned trust in your last answer, and this next question is about trust. So I'd love to talk more about that. I'm curious, what role does trust play when you're giving feedback? And so yeah, in the example you gave, the person who gave the feedback to you. And then also, how can you make yourself heard when you're giving feedback if you feel like trust isn't there, or maybe it's been lost for some reason?
Yeah. So first half of the question about just the importance of trust when giving feedback, I definitely feel like you want to at least assess it. Like, you want to kind of consider, I have some really good feedback from Matt, some stuff I want to share with Matt. What is our relationship like, right? Because we probably all know coworkers, friends, family members, people that we can probably say anything, and again, it doesn't have to be packaged well, but they still hear it, they still find the value. I'm thinking about a coworker that literally, like, I could just walk up and be like, Kelly, that was the stupidest thing I ever saw, and she'd be like, yeah, I know, like, but it was like, that was our relationship. So high trust, I think, makes us able and more willing to give feedback. It makes us a little bit less I would say present in the delivery, because we know that good intention is already there and that establishing of that is already there. And on the reverse, as I'm having this conversation or giving this feedback to whoever that I have a good trusting relationship with, I definitely think even in those situations, the person that gave me the feedback about my meetings, she knew, that I probably was going to be like, that's not my problem, but she also knew I would hear it because I trusted her, so I may have not liked it. I may have that human emotional reaction to it, yet I still hear it. So I think when we're thinking about giving feedback, just kind of assessing trust. If it's high trust relationships or high trust situations, it's easier and we don't have to work, I think, it's hard to be heard or to craft our messages, which takes me to the opposite. If there's a low trust situation, or even, a lot of times in the workplace, it's a new person, someone I haven't worked with very much, or maybe I've only, talked to them transactionally on, virtual meetings or Zooms or emails or whatever. Whenever there's low trust or an absence of trust, I think it's really important to consider, the feedback, why you want to give the feedback, how you're choosing to deliver the feedback, how, not even in just what you say, but even what method I might use. For example, someone I have a really close relationship, I might just shoot them a text, hey, blah, 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 because I know they're not going to read into much of it because of that relationship. But if it's a person I know that, low trust, no trust, don't really know them, I'm probably more likely to honestly Zoom meeting face to face if I can see them in person, or worst case scenario, call, because at least they get those other things in addition to just the words that I'm saying. So that delivery becomes a little bit more important, and just kind of assessing it and the awareness of it, and even just working to build trust, right? So making sure that, if I'm not recognizing that we have high trust in our situation, our relationship, before I'm just layering in the feedback, thinking about ways to build trust, getting to know a person, having a couple conversations with them that aren't work related. It doesn't have to be all of our deep, dark secrets, but just sometimes the casual, how was your weekend? What did you do? I saw that you just traveled somewhere. How was Samantha and I were talking about a trip I just came off of? Like, how was that trip? What are things you learned? Those things help to build trust, so that when we give feedback, again, we are a little bit more comfortable in sharing it, and that person honestly can kind of see we have their best intentions, at mind or in mind. And then the other kind of piece of the question about delivering that feedback in those situations where there may be questionable trust. Facts, you want to be behaviorally specific in that feedback. I don't want to just go to, Lindy and say, hey, in the meeting today, I just didn't feel like you were a team player. Because in that moment, those defenses are up. What do you mean not a team player? What, that kind of stuff. So I feel like the more factually and behaviorally specific you can describe it, the better. In the team meeting, we all kind of agreed, going in, this was going to be our position. And in the meeting, I heard you say these things, which weren't kind of aligned with what we previously agreed on. And it made me feel that maybe you changed your mind on the stance that you were taking along with the team, and then inviting Lindy into that conversation. What are your thoughts on what happened? What did you see happen? Help me understand your perspective. Because again, as we're giving that feedback, it's what did we actually see and hear, but it's also giving that person a chance to respond, because feedback should be two-way communication. It should be, here's my interpretation, perspective, experience. Here's the maybe impact. Here's what I'd love to see. Here's maybe the impact of that. How do you see things? Because it's getting that person in the conversation to turn it into that two-way that honestly makes it more likely that people act on our feedback. And when you're dealing with situations, low trust, questionable trust, don't really know each other, again, feedback is only as valuable as the person being able to walk away and do something with it. So it's like, how do we make sure that even in those situations, they can at least hear us, hear what's being shared, and have, a chance to respond, but even a chance to act. Because again, if people can't do anything with feedback, we can say we gave feedback all day long, but if someone else can't hear it, and sometimes a lot of times it's because of how we deliver it, it's a waste of everybody's time. So just kind of being mindful of that, especially in those trust situations. That's a good question.
Yeah, I'm glad that you ended your answer with that, because something that you said before when we were talking, you were talking about the low trust example. When you're considering the feedback, why do you even want to give it? I feel like something that I just work on myself is do I need to say anything right now? Is there something to add? And I feel like, especially at GitLab and probably at other places too, we talk so much about how feedback is important. And I'm not trying to say that feedback isn't important, but it actionable feedback is important, not just give all the feedback you can. There's a difference.
Yeah, I like it. Because again, it's the goal of feedback should be development, or it should be, awareness, or it should be something that this person can do something with. One of the things that I remember hearing long ago was if, something is small, like a small situation, it won't happen again, and the person maybe already feels bad about it, right? Is that even something we need to come and give feedback on, right? So just even kind of considering those dimensions. If it's a little thing, they're already aware, maybe they've already kind of expressed remorse about it, or, understanding of the error or mistake. Like you said, it's not a moment to come, well, let me just come tell you, so really even just what's the value of this feedback for this other person? Why do I want to share this feedback? How are they going to be able to use it to improve, to grow, develop? And even going in kind of with I only have my perspective of it. So am I even willing to hear their response and maybe understand or learn something that I didn't when I give this feedback? Which I think is important to consider too, that empathy and humility, and why is this even important? Is it just about me, or is it about the we? And if it's about the we, now let me make sure I set the tone for this message to be heard.
Great. Thanks, Maria.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I have one more question. Oh, I'm getting some feedback. Hang on. Make sure everyone's muted. I have one more question, and then after this last question, we'll move on to team member questions. So if you all have questions for Maria, feel free to add them to the agenda. This last one is about getting constructive or difficult to hear feedback, and it can be challenging to both give and receive. And sometimes it doesn't go as intended, kind of like what the intent piece we've been talking about. So the question is, what can we do when there's been a misunderstanding about intention when giving or receiving feedback?
I like that question. I think kind of the shortest answer is just recognize that people aren't perfect. So again, as we're delivering and receiving feedback, once it kind of leaves our mouths or our fingers, if we're sending it in a written form, we really have no control over what happens with it. Honestly, like our best goal is for it to be received, heard as we intended, and people to be able to act on it. And in reality, once it becomes theirs, once we pass it on, we've kind of lost the control over it. So I definitely feel like being willing to understand that there can be misunderstandings, being willing to, correct those misinterpretations of maybe what I'm sharing, being willing to, on the receiving end, kind of question even my own story about this. Like, maybe they meant it from a bad place, and why else would someone tell me this? Maybe they, intended to hurt my feelings, and, I don't think they did because they actually care. So I definitely feel like, being willing to kind of question our own selves, our own reasoning for it, just kind of look at the data for what the data actually is, like what they've actually said and not just what we thought about what they said, just kind of helps us to be able to be willing to engage in it, hear it, and honestly own up if we make a mistake or if we share feedback in a way that it's misunderstood. But I think part of it too is going to be, I need the person to at least tell me that. I may not ever hear that I gave Tina some feedback and Tina didn't like what I shared or felt that it went the wrong way if I don't have almost like have already created a space where Tina would feel comfortable saying to me, "Hey Maria, I didn't like that," or "What did you mean?" or that kind of stuff. So I think we have to be mindful of our story and other people's story. And again, perception is people's reality. But I think the more that we can honor erring on the side of specifics and data and behavior and description, the less we are likely to leave things open to misunderstanding. And even in those situations, being willing to hear if someone took it the wrong way, being able to, kind of appreciate people willing to come back and tell us that they didn't like how we shared it or they perceived it one way when we meant it a different way. There was someone I had a conversation with recently, and I was saying something and I literally meant it, just like as a standard like question, but I didn't punctuate it correctly. And this was like in a written form. And they kind of reacted to, the message because it almost was like a directive when it really was a question. And for me, it was like I had to own, like, yeah, I contributed to this misunderstanding, right? So being okay with owning when we mess up, being okay with being willing to correct, hear other people's perspectives, and then as best as possible, just trying to remove any potential for misunderstanding in the way that we deliver these messages, which takes me back to, you're not a team player versus, we agree on these things and it seems like you went a different way, or you're a liar versus I asked this and I heard this answer, but when I looked at it, it looked different, right? So sometimes in the way that we deliver it, we can kind of remove a lot of misunderstanding opportunity. But even in the situations where there is misunderstanding, being willing to hear it, and being willing to honor where we might have made a mistake or done something that contributed to the misunderstanding, and wanting to correct it. And even on the receiving end, kind of those same thoughts.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Both super
Yeah.
important to be really specific about the feedback that we're giving and being open to hearing when we gave it in a way that didn't really work. Okay, well, I'm going to move us on to our team member questions. We have a few in there and we'll go through as many as we can. The first one is from Laurel. She's not on the call, so I'll voice it for her. Laurel's question is, what does active listening look like when communicating asynchronously?
Ooh, that's a toughie. Because, and I say it's a toughie because listening, so asynchronous kind of is two events not happening at the same time, right? Someone watching this session that we're recording right now, tomorrow, right? So I think one thing is, I don't think you can actively communicate to the speaker or communicate to the other person that you're listening if the events are happening at two different times, which is challenging. But I definitely think that potential of being able to, like, kind of for yourself, really dedicate the time and the space to listen is going to be important, because I am horrible at watching webinars after they happen. I will be the first to admit it, right? Because again, I'm watching it. It happened yesterday. I'm watching the recording. It's happening. I'm doing it differently. And it's easy to get distracted, and it's easy to multitask that we think we are so good at. And it's like being honest with myself. Like, I need to be present. Like, I need to pay attention, especially if it's something that I've committed to being a part of, learning from, growing from. And so for me, it's like I have to block out all potential for distractions. And I think that's what active listening in that asynchronous environment might look like. Acting as if you're in that present conversation or present situation right then. So what would you do if you were sitting across from this person or this group of persons and actively here in the conversation at the time that it was happening? Honor those things, turn off other distractions, turn away from other things, silence all those notifications, because I think even if it's just you listening to this after the fact, it will, one, allow you to get way more value out of whatever is being shared or whatever the message is. And I think, two, it also gives you that potential to do some follow-up, which is another way you can communicate back. Hey, I was paying attention. I was listening. I heard these different points. They were really good. Here's what I took from what you shared. Thank you for sharing this. Here are some action items I'm planning to take as a result of, whatever was shared. Because that communicates back to the speaker that even though we weren't having this conversation real time, I heard, I listened, I'm taking away from it. And it's something that's important. So for yourself, just kind of honoring what practices would you do if you were in that conversation real time, and then to communicate to that other person that you heard them, that follow-up is really helpful. Paraphrasing, action steps, and maybe even recapping high points of what they shared that you found valuable.
Yeah, great. I like that. Thinking about, like, what if I was actually having this live conversation? And at GitLab, a lot of like the asynchronous communication we do is text-based. And I think that I think we had you have a whole conversation about tone in text-based communication. And I think that I think there's a connection there, because if you're honoring like the way that you would speak to someone live, and you are using that same kind of tone and approach in your text, it's more authentic to how you would truly respond if you were speaking.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's tips for myself. Like, that's stuff I have to tell myself. Would I or say this if I was sitting here talking to the person, or would I be half playing Candy Crush, which I know we don't play Candy Crush anymore. My daughter told me that was like so 10 years ago, but whatever. As I'm replying to this person and getting distracted, or, what would those spaces look like in communication if it was real life versus, getting over here doing this and then answering whenever I feel like it. So yeah, thank you, Lindy. Me too. She says, nobody plays Candy Crush anymore. Yeah.
Awesome. Cal, you have the next question. Do you want to voice it?
Yes, thank you. Hey, Maria, great session so far. So my question is, as a feedback receiver, what are some of the important things that I should keep in mind while doing a follow-up? And do I have the responsibility to close the feedback loop, or is it the giver's responsibility to close the feedback loop?
I like that question, Cal. That is such a good question. I definitely feel like, I guess it could depend, right? So if I'm receiving feedback and I'm wanting to kind of check back in or kind of close the loop myself, I think for me, one of the things is just communicating back to the person. And even in situations like I was sharing earlier, where I may have not loved the feedback. Did I freeze up?
Oh, you're back.
Okay. I don't know what happened. It's windy here. So yeah. Okay. But I think one of the things to kind of close that loop might be action items of what you plan to do with the feedback. I think that's always really helpful, because it lets the person know, I heard it, and here's what I maybe agreed with, or here's the steps I'm willing to take to kind of change these things. So I think maybe if you're able to just kind of say, I appreciate you sharing that feedback that you shared, here's what I took from it, or here's what I heard from the message, and here are some things I'm planning to implement, or here are some things I'm planning to do. I think what that does is it gives you, a way to process and kind of find, again, the value in the feedback and what you want to communicate. But I think what it does also is it reinforces to the other person like, yes, tell me stuff, because if I'm giving you feedback and I'm never hearing back on anything you're doing with it or any actions you're taking, it may honestly make me less likely to give you feedback, going forward. So I think something about just saying, I appreciate this that you shared, Adrian. It was really helpful. Here's some things that I'm planning to do differently, or here's what I took away from what you shared. Communicates to Adrian, like, keep giving me this, keep giving me this because I'm actually doing something with it. So that's one thought. And I definitely feel like, whose responsibility that is, just kind of depends on what the feedback is. For me, as a feedback giver, I sometimes will follow up with, just to kind of recap, we talked, and here were some things that we went over, and I appreciate you sharing this perspective I didn't have. So I may send just kind of like a summary of our conversation as a feedback giver, and maybe even some high points of the descriptors or what I actually saw, just to kind of share with this person, again, here's something you can look at later, and kind of process. Because as a giver, while we may be having this conversation right now, and you may be hearing me back to emotions and back to hearing stuff that you may not like right then, you may need a moment to kind of process. And so kind of recapping as the giver, here's what we talked about, here's where we agreed, here are some thoughts, here's some takeaways, helps that person to have that to look at later. So that's what I tend to try to do as a giver. But as a receiver, to me too, it's the same kind of thing. Like I said, giving kind of the thank you for the conversation. Here's what I took away from it. Here's what I plan to do differently. But I think it just can depend on who you're talking to, the conversation, what the topic is, whose responsibility that kind of is in the conversation. Good question, Cal. Very good.
Lindy, you have the next one.
Yeah, so I think for a lot of people, it's really tough to hear corrective feedback. And sometimes the natural reaction seems to be to get defensive. So I was wondering if you had any tips on how someone can prepare themselves to receive corrective feedback without kind of getting into a defensive state, or if you have any tips for managers on how to help team members get prepared to hear corrective feedback without getting into that defensive state.
I love that, Lindy. All right. Yes, constructive feedback. While we know it's good for us, it's like taking castor oil in the South when you were a kid. You had to take it all the time just to not get sick. It was disgusting, right? You hate taking the pre-medicine or hearing it because you know it's going to help you, but it tastes nasty. So I definitely feel like on the receiver end, it's emotions, it's natural responses. And again, sometimes it's not even stuff that we know we're doing, and to hear that, it's coming across as whatever is like a slap in the face. Those natural responses, we want to deny, we want to defend, or we want to deflect. It wasn't me, it was me, but here's why, or you didn't get on to Jeff when he did it, so that's like kind of our natural responses. And I definitely say on the receiving end, one way to kind of best self-manage comes from crucial conversations. One of my favorite skills, mastering our story, kind of saying, this person is sharing these things. Here's the why I'm telling myself they're sharing it, which is a lot of times driving that emotion. And it causes me to go into those other behaviors. And really just kind of backing it up to, instead of getting into a negative story about why, they're trying to make me feel bad, they're trying to make me look bad, they don't care, they're setting me up, all those things. Really just going back to what was actually shared. What did I actually hear? What were the data points? What were the things that were said? What were the things I observed? Because I think just separating that factual experience from the why, the story we're telling ourselves, can just kind of help us in the moment, keep those emotions under control, keep our emotions intact, or even go in with emotions of curiosity, rather than thinking that Isabel's out to get me. Maybe Isabel, is really trying to help me in this situation, rather than thinking that Dave is, setting me up. Maybe, this is going on. And even just that questioning, a lot of times can help us in those moments to just not immediately put up that defensive wall. But even so, I always say too, recognizing it. Like if you're in that moment and you feel those emotions kind of triggering up and you're kind of having a hard time processing that feedback, recognize them for yourself. Like this is what's happening and it's okay. It's not that it's a bad thing. But also, to me, one thing is like writing, so if someone's talking and maybe I'm feeling myself getting a little by their feedback, writing down what I'm hearing them say, writing down what I'm hearing, discuss, writing down maybe even some thoughts I have about what they're saying, rather than immediately reacting to it, helps me to kind of keep that in a space where I can at least still hear the person, have something to walk away with and process later versus that reactive response. So one of my favorite tips is, which is hard to do, when someone gives that feedback, just saying thank you. and that's it. All the other stuff you want to say and do, write it down, but out of your mouth, just say thank you. I was working with the CEO and founder a couple weeks ago in Oregon, and his team was giving him feedback on his leadership, and he wanted to hear feedback. And he's like, how am I doing? Like, I started this thing 5 years ago by myself. Now, 5 years later, we have an entire business and I got a leadership team and I don't even know how to be a CEO. And he was really, truly wanting feedback. But as people were sharing things with him, he kept going, yeah, well, here's why I did that, or here, well, tell me, and the more he did that, the more people shut down. And so I kind of had to ping him like, Jeremy, just say thank you, write it down. Just say thank you, right? Write down what they're saying, maybe write down that thought about why or the what or the ins and the outs. Don't say it, just say thank you. And when he got to, like, we took a break and like had a little conversation. So when he got back into it, and people would share things, he would just say thank you. It honestly let him hear more because people would keep going and they would share more information and they would share more of that constructive feedback when he just said thank you and wrote it down. And then my tip for him was, after the fact, if you want to share any of these insights or perspectives, have a conversation. I appreciate you sharing the feedback in our meeting last week. I took it away. I took some thought into it. I wanted to share some additional pieces of it. Would you be okay hearing that? And let that be a separate conversation. And so that was some tips on that piece. And then as a manager, being able to get people ready to hear, which I think was the second part of the question, that feedback. Up front, sharing your good intentions. I think that's important. If I hit up, Eduardo and say, hey, Eduardo, can you come to my office? We need to talk. From the moment I say that to the moment Eduardo's butt hits the seat of my office, his brain is going to be spinning. What does Maria want? What is she about to do? Am I in trouble? What did I mess up on? He says, yep, in the chat. Like, where did I go wrong? Like, what did I goof this? So I think removing that as much as possible up front helps people come in a better space to hear that. Eduardo, I want to talk to you about some things a little bit later. This isn't a conversation where you're in trouble or anything bad is going to happen. Get that out of your mind. I want to point out some things I've noticed over the last week, get your perspective on what's been occurring, and maybe see where we can kind of find some agreement of some things to do going forward. That's what I want the conversation to be about. So I would kind of preempt with that so that I'm in trouble is out of the way, where problem solving is in the way, in the brain. And people usually come in a little bit less defensive. But I even say in the moment, if I notice, maybe I'm having this conversation and I see Marina kind of shutting down or leaning back or closing off, kind of handing the microphone over to them helps. I've shared some thoughts, some things that I've noticed. I'd love to hear your input on it. Share a little bit from me, your perspective about what's going on. And as the manager, I think that encourages people to be in the conversation, to hear, but to also see that you are picking up that it's uncomfortable and you're giving them a chance to kind of voice some of that, which I think for managers, sometimes it's like we go through our checklist of feedback stuff we want to share and it's like, all right, bye. But sometimes just noticing, seeing what's happening, that pause, that allowing that person to share in the moment. How are you feeling about what I just shared? What are some thoughts that you have about what I just shared? Helps to encourage those people in our team to be able to share back and speak with us in those moments where that feedback is uncomfortable. But and what I said in the chat, that context up front, super helpful, because I see so many managers say, hey, we need to talk, or can you come meet with me at 2:00? Or I just get a Zoom invite on my calendar. And from the moment I see it pop up, I'm spiraling out. So I'm coming in defensive and you might be like, hey, you're the best employee ever. And I'm ready to say, but it wasn't my fault, already. So even that context up front helps. That helps. Good question.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Renato, it looks like you have the last one. Are you still here? Don't know. I think I'll voice it because I'm not sure if they're still here. So their question is, how do you encourage your stakeholder or manager to have continuous feedback versus waiting until annual review to share feedback?
I'm gonna tell you the worst way I ever saw that happen. I remember sitting outside of an office, and I was like at my desk working, and it was the mid-year. It wasn't even the end, it was the mid-year conversation. And this person got up and went in the office with their manager to have the conversation. And the only thing I remember hearing was the person screaming at their manager, if I've been doing this wrong for 6 months, then why the heck are you just telling me? And it was like, oh, first of all, why am I hearing that all the way out here, that screaming? But it was so real of, why would you let somebody do something wrong for 6 months without telling them? So I love that question because it's there's the requirements of, we set goals, maybe we meet, and then we have the annual review. But again, you're leaving so much time for people to be messing up or to be doing things wrong or to be thinking that they're doing the right thing and not getting feedback. I'm a big fan of a continuous performance management process. So a lot of managers I work with, and I know this question is the reverse, but a lot of managers I work with, I coach them on the importance of day-to-day feedback, one-on-one conversations, and alignment conversations. And those should happen in between those kind of standard reviews. And so just to kind of give a calendar, let's say fiscal year starts in February, right? February, we start setting goals, we establish, the key, responsibility areas, we set all that stuff. We don't want it to be, December of next year before we give any feedback. So again, from that February till about that March, April, May timeframe, one-on-one conversations where we have a kind of a standard cadence of checking in, meeting with each other, and just saying, how is everything going as it relates to these goals, as it relates to these responsibilities? And then that day-to-day feedback, both in the area of correcting feedback, which is, kind of what we're talking about in that good question Lindy asked, where, sometimes I need to hear where I'm not doing things right, but also reinforcing feedback. And I don't think I've even focused on that a lot here, but reinforcing feedback. You want to catch people doing good. I don't want to only have every conversation with Tatiana be corrective. I want to, say to Tatiana, not just good job, but even, hey, last week you had this conversation with this customer and things were kind of challenging. And I saw you stepped in and kind of brought the customer's concerns down. And by the end of it, they walked away happy and everything was intact on, the subscription. And I'm glad that you did that. And I appreciate you doing that. Like, we don't do that enough, that corrective, reinforcing feedback. So from a manager side, I generally say, you can add in one-on-ones, you can add in day-to-day feedback, and you can even add in like a quarterly alignment, which is exactly what it sounds like. We sit down, we check the tires, we rotate them, we make sure everything's good into your process, whatever that process is. Those are 3 types of conversations that are in a manager's control to have a one-on-one that you schedule once a week, bi-weekly, once a month, whatever. That's a scheduled meeting, 30 minutes to an hour. Let's sit down, let's check in. You also have that alignment once a quarter and that feedback as needed both ways. But I think, when you're wanting more of that from your manager and you're not getting it, sometimes it's just asking for it. Because I feel like a lot of managers don't necessarily recognize that employees want more feedback. They don't, necessarily, and again, if they're dealing with things that they're dealing with, they don't necessarily, recognize who wants that feedback and who doesn't, who wants to connect more and who doesn't. So I remember actually, I used to schedule with my manager. I would send her a calendar invite and I would say, hey, Jill, we need to meet, at least when I first was on the team, at least bi-weekly, 30 minutes, on this Thursday, let's have a standing meeting where we just come together. And part of it was for me to say, hey, here's what I've been working on. Here's what I need your help with. Here's where I'm finding some roadblocks and some barriers I would love to have you remove for me on these different tasks. Here's the status update, which she liked because it kept her abreast of everything that was happening. But a large part of that conversation was, what's your perspective on how I've been performing on these different things I'm responsible for? And I was just straight up asking for feedback in that meeting. And so it was kind of, a little bit different. It was me saying, here's what I'm working on. Let me give you an update. But now you tell me your perspective of me. And because it was a standard meeting, it was standard operating procedure. We got comfortable doing it. It worked really well. As I got more skilled in my task or more skilled in my projects, things I was working on, those meetings went to once a month. Then they went to like once every 2 months. And then they went to just like whenever I felt like I needed a checkup with her, I would say, hey, can we have a one-on-one meeting and just kind of send it randomly? But it was me asking the manager for this opportunity to receive feedback. And again, a lot of times they don't realize people want it or need it as much as they do. So just asking for it may be something they like, and maybe they encourage other people to do because maybe they're not even aware that we want that much feedback. So my tip would be just kind of ask, say, hey, I want to, set up some kind of cadence of meeting and connecting so I can get feedback because that's the only thing that's going to help me get better. And I'd love to share with you what I'm working on, my progress, ask for your help with these barriers and roadblocks, and also have an opportunity to check in and see how I'm doing. And I think most managers would appreciate that. Any managers in the house, what do you think about that?
I agree.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Maria. That was a great question. We have a few more minutes left. There's no more questions in the agenda, but I'll just put the ask out one more time. Does anyone else who's left on the call have a question for Maria? Okay. So if something comes up and you want to send it my way, I can send it to Maria later. But just wanted to send a lot of appreciation your way, Maria. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate everyone who came to the call, making time for this, because making time for learning and being part of these discussions is so important. It makes us all better people. So thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience, and looking forward to having you back at GitLab soon.
Thank you. I appreciated it. Thank you, everyone. Good discussion and good questions. I love really good questions. So thank y'all. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon.